The autumn wind whistled through the empty halls of the Victorian mansion on College Hill, its melancholic sound echoing the hollow feeling in Eleanor Aldrich's heart. She stood at the bay window of her study, watching brown leaves dance across her manicured lawn, each swirl reminding her of the life that once filled these rooms. The morning light filtered through the stained glass, casting colourful shadows that seemed to mock the greyness that had consumed her world over the past year. Eleanor's perfectly manicured fingers traced the outline of a silver frame on her antique mahogany desk. The photograph inside captured a moment frozen in time, a young man with her same hazel eyes and gentle smile, wearing a graduation cap and gown, his whole life ahead of him. That photograph was taken just 3 months before the accident that changed everything. The grandfather clock in the hallway chimed 9 times, pulling Eleanor from her reverie. Another day she would have to face, another series of hours to fill with meaningless activities. Her social calendar, once bursting with charity galas and board meetings, had gradually emptied over the past year as she withdrew from Providence's high society. Even her position as chair of the Rhode Island Historical Society's Board of Trustees, a role she had cherished for over a decade, held no appeal anymore. Mrs. Sullivan, her housekeeper of 20 years, knocked softly on the study door. "Ms. Aldrich, your breakfast is getting cold and Dr. Bennett called to confirm your appointment for this afternoon." Eleanor sighed, her breath fogging the window pane. "Thank you, Margaret. You can cancel the appointment. I'm not feeling up to it today." "But Miss Aldrich, this is the 3rd time you've cancelled. The doctor says—" "I said cancel it," Eleanor interrupted, her voice firm but tired. She heard Mrs. Sullivan's retreating footsteps and felt a twinge of guilt. The housekeeper had been more than an employee over the years. She had been a friend, a confidant. But lately, Eleanor couldn't bear the concern in her eyes, the careful way she tiptoed around certain subjects, the gentle suggestions that perhaps it was time to move forward. Moving forward seemed impossible when every corner of the house held memories. The kitchen still had Timothy's favorite cereal in the pantry. His room remained untouched, college acceptance letters still pinned to the bulletin board, his lacrosse stick leaning against the wall exactly where he'd left it that final morning. Eleanor couldn't bring herself to change anything, as if preserving these details could somehow preserve the life she'd lost. The phone rang again and Eleanor let it go to voicemail, probably another well-meaning friend or family member checking in, offering platitudes about time healing all wounds. They didn't understand that some wounds weren't meant to heal, that some losses carved such deep valleys in your soul that no amount of time could fill them. Looking at her reflection in the window, Eleanor barely recognized herself. At 48, she had always taken pride in her appearance, but now her chestnut hair, though still expertly colored and styled, seemed lackluster. The tailored clothes that had once given her confidence hung loosely on her frame, and dark circles shadowed her eyes despite expensive creams and treatments. A sudden gust of wind rattled the windows, and Eleanor wrapped her cashmere sweater tighter around herself. Fall in Providence had always been her favorite season. She and Timothy would walk through Roger Williams Park, admiring the changing colors, getting hot apple cider from their favorite vendor. Now the beauty of the season felt like a betrayal, nature's audacity to continue its cycle when her own life had come to such an abrupt halt. Mrs. Sullivan appeared again, this time with a cup of tea and Eleanor's favorite scone from Seven Stars Bakery. She placed them on the desk without a word, but her presence lingered for a moment, heavy with unspoken concern. "The garden club called," Mrs. Sullivan said finally. "They're hoping you'll reconsider hosting the annual autumn fundraiser. Mrs. Blackwell said they'd understand if you wanted to scale it back this year." Eleanor turned from the window, her eyes falling on the tea service, fine bone china that had belonged to her grandmother. The autumn fundraiser had been her pride and joy for 15 years. The gardens of the Aldrich mansion transformed into a wonderland of chrysanthemums and pumpkins, raising thousands for local children's charities. Timothy had always helped, manning the cider station, charming the elderly patrons with his easy smile and impeccable manners. "Tell them I'll think about it," Eleanor replied, knowing she wouldn't. The thought of filling the gardens with laughter and life seemed impossible. How could she host a celebration when her heart felt like a mausoleum? She picked up the teacup, its familiar weight anchoring her to the present moment. The steam rising from the Earl Grey created ghostly patterns in the air, reminding her of mornings spent teaching Timothy proper tea etiquette when he was small. He'd balanced the cup so carefully, determined to be grown up like his mother, his little pinky extended in exaggerated sophistication. Outside, a school bus rumbled past, children's voices carrying faintly through the windows. Eleanor closed her eyes, remembering different mornings, different voices. She had stood at this same window countless times, watching Timothy board that same bus, always turning to wave goodbye. The memory was so vivid she could almost see him there now, perpetually 12 years old, perpetually waving, perpetually alive in her mind. The tea grew cold in her hands, untouched, as Eleanor remained lost in her memories, a solitary figure in a mansion full of ghosts. The early morning fog rolled in from Narragansett Bay, shrouding the industrial district of Valley in a thick grey blanket. Marco Carnaval adjusted his prosthetic leg before carefully making his way down the uneven path toward the recycling center, the metal crutch under his right arm providing extra stability on the slick ground. The sound of seagulls crying overhead mixed with the distant hum of machinery, creating the familiar symphony of his daily routine. At 26, Marco's face carried the weathered look of someone who had faced more challenges than his years suggested, but his dark eyes retained a warmth that even hardship couldn't extinguish. He paused at the chain-link fence surrounding the recycling center, catching his breath and watching the other workers arrive. Most nodded in greeting. They were all familiar faces here, each carrying their own stories of struggle and survival. "Hey, Marco," called out Joe, the center's supervisor. "Got some good stuff coming in today. Bunch of electronics from that office building renovation on Benefit Street." Marco smiled, grateful for the heads up. Electronics meant copper wire, and copper wire meant better money. "Thanks, Joe. I'll keep an eye out." Inside the facility, Marco made his way to his usual sorting station. The work was hard on his body, especially with the prosthetic, but he had developed a system over the years. His upper body strength compensated for his limitation, and his keen eye for valuable materials made him one of the most efficient workers, despite his disability. As he worked, Marco's mind wandered to his family's small apartment above De Pasquale Square. His mother, Rosa, would be getting ready for her shift at the nursing home, while his sister, Sophia, would be preparing for another day of online classes when she felt strong enough. The thought of Sophia pushed Marco to work faster, his hands moving methodically through the pile of materials before him. Sophia's medical bills were mounting, and the insurance only covered so much. The experimental treatment her doctors recommended wasn't covered at all, but Marco refused to give up hope. Every piece of metal he salvaged, every wire he stripped, brought them one step closer to affording it. "Take a break, kid," Joe called out around noon. "You're making the rest of us look bad." Marco straightened up, wincing as his back protested. He'd been so focused on his work he hadn't noticed the time. Reaching into his worn backpack, he pulled out the lunch his mother had packed, a simple sandwich wrapped in wax paper, with a note tucked inside as always. Rosa's handwriting was cramped but neat. "Remember to rest me, Ophelia. You are not alone in this fight." The break room was empty except for Maria, an elderly woman who had been working at the center longer than anyone could remember. She was heating up something that smelled deliciously of garlic and basil in the microwave. "Ah, Marco," she said warmly. "I made too much pasta fagioli yesterday. Share with me?" Marco started to decline. He hated accepting charity, but Maria was already dividing the soup into 2 bowls. "My Anthony used to work twice as hard when he had a good lunch in his stomach," she said, referring to her late husband. "Mangia, mangia." As they ate, Marco listened to Maria's stories about the old Federal Hill neighborhood, when every street corner had a different vendor selling fruits or fresh bread, and everyone knew everyone else's business. Her tales painted a picture of a Providence that was rapidly disappearing, replaced by trendy restaurants and luxury condos. The soup warmed more than just his stomach. It reminded him of Sunday dinners when his father was still alive, before the accident that took both his leg and his dad. The memory brought a familiar ache, but Marco had learned to live with it, just as he'd learned to live with everything else life had thrown at him. A commotion outside drew their attention. Through the break room window, Marco could see a group of workers gathering around something near the fence. He grabbed his crutch and made his way outside, curiosity getting the better of him. There, tangled in some discarded wire, was a small dog, dirty, skinny, and clearly injured. The animal whimpered as people approached, showing signs of past abuse. Without hesitation, Marco lowered himself carefully to the ground, speaking softly in Italian the way his grandmother used to speak to scared animals. "Easy there, Piccolo," he murmured, slowly extending his hand. "No one's going to hurt you here." The dog's eyes, though fearful, met Marco's with an intelligence that touched something deep in his soul. Despite his own precarious financial situation, despite knowing another mouth to feed was the last thing his family needed, Marco knew he couldn't leave this creature to fend for itself. "What are you going to name him?" Maria asked, appearing beside him with a bottle of water and some crackers from her lunch. Marco watched as the dog cautiously accepted a cracker from his hand. "Rocky," he said after a moment. "He's a fighter like me." As if understanding, the dog's tail gave a tentative wag. Marco's gentle persistence paid off as Rocky allowed himself to be freed from the wire. The dog's trust, so cautiously given, reminded Marco of his own journey of learning to accept help after his accident. The rest of the afternoon passed in a blur of sorting and salvaging, with Rocky curled up nearby, watching his every move. The dog's presence somehow made the monotonous work feel lighter, and Marco found himself talking to his new companion, sharing his dreams and fears in a way he never could with his family. He had to be strong for them. As the sun began to set over the bay, casting long shadows across the industrial landscape, Marco gathered his day's earnings and prepared for the journey home. Rocky followed at his heels, already acting as if he'd found his purpose in life. Looking down at the dog, Marco felt a spark of something he hadn't experienced in a long time: hope. Together, man and dog made their way through the streets of Providence, two wounded souls who had found in each other a chance at healing. The city lights began to twinkle on Federal Hill, guiding them home, where Marco knew his mother would pretend to be upset about the dog, but would end up feeding it before the night was over. Some things, like a mother's heart, never changed, no matter how hard life became. Roger Williams Park was alive with the colors of autumn, the crisp October air carrying the scent of fallen leaves and distant sea salt. Eleanor Aldrich found herself there almost by accident, having driven aimlessly through Providence's winding streets after another sleepless night. The park had been Timothy's favorite place, and for months she'd avoided it, but today something drew her to its winding paths. The early morning joggers and dog walkers paid little attention to the elegantly dressed woman sitting alone on a weathered bench near the Botanical Center. Eleanor watched a group of art students from RISD setting up their easels, their young faces bright with purpose and possibility. Their enthusiasm reminded her of Timothy's passion for photography, how he would spend hours in this very park, capturing the changing seasons through his lens. The peaceful moment was interrupted by commotion near the weekend farmers' market. A small child's cry pierced the air, followed by the sound of panic. Eleanor found herself moving toward the sound before she realized what she was doing, her heels clicking against the cobblestone path. At the market's entrance, she found a scene of confusion. A little girl, no more than 5, was crying hysterically, surrounded by concerned vendors and shoppers. Through her sobs, the child managed to explain that she'd gotten separated from her grandmother while shopping. "It's okay, Piccola," a gentle male voice cut through the chaos. Eleanor turned to see a young man with olive skin and kind eyes, supporting himself with a crutch, kneeling awkwardly to reach the child's eye level. A scruffy dog sat attentively at his side. "What's your name?" "Lucy," the girl hiccuped, momentarily distracted by the dog. "I'm Marco, and this is Rocky," he said, gesturing to the dog, who wagged his tail at the mention of his name. "He's very good at finding people. Want to help us look for your grandmother?" Eleanor watched as Marco somehow managed to transform the child's fear into an adventure. He pulled a tissue from his pocket to dry Lucy's tears, then reached into his worn wallet and bought her a warm apple cider from a nearby vendor. The simple gesture struck Eleanor. She could see that the few dollars he spent probably meant skipping his own lunch, yet he didn't hesitate. "My grandmother's wearing a blue coat," Lucy offered, clutching her cider with both hands, "and she has white hair like snow." "Perfect clues for our search party," Marco responded with enthusiasm. "Rocky, we're looking for a lady in blue. Think you can help?" The dog seemed to understand, leading them through the market at a careful pace that accommodated both Marco's limitation and Lucy's short legs. Eleanor found herself following, drawn into their small search party. They found Lucy's grandmother near the flower vendors, frantically searching and speaking with market security. The reunion was tearful and joyful, with the grandmother alternating between hugging Lucy and thanking Marco profusely. "Please," she insisted, opening her purse, "let me give you something for your kindness." Marco shook his head, his smile genuine but tired. "No need, Signora, just seeing Lucy safe is enough." He turned to the little girl. "Remember to stay close to your grandmother next time, okay?" As the grandmother and granddaughter walked away hand in hand, Eleanor noticed Marco discreetly leaning more heavily on his crutch, clearly exhausted from the morning's excitement. Rocky pressed against his good leg, offering support. "That was remarkable," Eleanor found herself saying, surprising both Marco and herself. It was the first time she'd initiated a conversation with a stranger in months. Marco looked up, seeming to really notice her for the first time. "Sometimes people just need a little kindness," he said simply, "even if it's just a cup of cider and a friendly face." Something about his words, about the genuine warmth in his expression, made Eleanor's carefully maintained composure crack slightly. Would you join me for coffee?" she asked, gesturing toward the small cafe at the edge of the market. "As a thank you for restoring my faith in humanity, even if just for a moment." Marco hesitated, and Eleanor could see him weighing his pride against something else, perhaps the same inexplicable pull that had made her extend the invitation. Finally, he nodded. "Only if Rocky is welcome too." "Of course," Eleanor found herself smiling, really smiling, for the first time in what felt like forever. "I believe they have outdoor seating." They made their way to the cafe, an odd trio. The impeccably dressed society woman, the working-class young man with his crutch, and the rescue dog padding faithfully alongside. The morning sun had burned away the last of the fog, and the park around them buzzed with weekend activity. As they settled at a small wrought-iron table, Eleanor noticed Marco scanning the menu prices, his expression carefully neutral. "Please order whatever you'd like," she said softly. "I insist." Their conversation started hesitantly, with careful observations about the weather and the park's beauty. But as their coffee arrived, accompanied by warm cranberry scones, something shifted. Perhaps it was the way Rocky rested his head on Eleanor's expensive boots without her minding, or how Marco's genuine interest in her thoughts about the park's historical architecture broke through her practiced social veneer. "I used to come here with my son," Eleanor found herself saying, the words slipping out before she could stop them. "He loved this park in autumn." Marco's expression showed understanding rather than pity, a crucial difference that made Eleanor's heart ache a little less. "My father and I used to fish near the bay," he offered in return. "Some places hold memories so strong they become part of us." Their shared acknowledgement of loss hung in the air between them, not heavy with expectations or social obligations, but gentle with mutual understanding. As they talked, Eleanor found herself noticing things she'd missed in her months of isolation: the way the sunlight played on the pond's surface, the laughter of children at the nearby playground, the simple pleasure of a warm drink on a cool morning. For Marco, the conversation revealed layers to Providence he'd never considered, as Eleanor shared stories about the park's history and the city's evolution. Her knowledge wasn't delivered with condescension, but with genuine enthusiasm, reminding him of the stories he used to share with the neighborhood children before life became too demanding. As their coffee cups emptied and the morning wore on, both Eleanor and Marco felt something shift in their respective worlds. Neither could have predicted that a lost child in a farmer's market would lead to this moment, or that their chance encounter would be the first thread in a tapestry of change that would transform both their lives. The walk home from Roger Williams Park felt different to Marco that afternoon. Despite the weight of his prosthetic leg and the day's fatigue, his steps seemed lighter. Rocky trotted beside him, occasionally looking up as if checking that his human was still processing the morning's unexpected events. The sounds and smells of Federal Hill embraced them as they approached home: garlic and basil from vendor ravioli, the cheerful chatter from the cafes lining Atwell's Avenue, the church bells from Holy Ghost Church marking the hour. These familiar sensations had always been a comfort, but today they seemed to highlight how his world had briefly intersected with something entirely different. As Marco climbed the narrow stairs to their apartment, he could hear Sophia coughing through the thin walls. His sister's illness had worsened over the past few months, each medical bill adding to the mountain of debt that kept him awake at night. Yet the morning's conversation with Eleanor had awakened something in him, a reminder that there was still beauty and connection to be found, even in the hardest times. "Marco? Is that you?" Rosa's voice called out as he entered. She emerged from the kitchen, wiping her hands on her apron, then stopped short at the sight of Rocky. "Madonna Santa, what is this?" "Mama, this is Rocky," Marco said quickly before she could protest. "He needed a home, and he's very well behaved. Plus, I think Sophia could use the company when we're at work." Rosa's expression softened at the mention of Sophia, though she tried to maintain her stern look. "Another mouth to feed, figlio mio? And who will take care of him when you're working?" "I will," Sophia's voice came from her bedroom doorway. She stood there in her oversized sweater, her face pale but her eyes bright with interest. "He can keep me company during my online classes." Marco watched as Rocky, seeming to sense his fate hung in the balance, padded over to Sophia and gently nuzzled her hand. His sister's delighted laugh was worth any sacrifice he'd have to make to keep the dog fed. "Dio mio," Rosa sighed, but Marco could see her resolve crumbling. "At least he's house-trained." Before Marco could answer, Sophia was already leading Rocky to her room, talking softly to him about her upcoming art history class. The sound of her voice, stronger than it had been in weeks, filled the small apartment with hope. "Something's different about you today," Rosa observed, studying her son's face as she returned to preparing Sunday dinner. "Did something happen at work?" Marco helped himself to a glass of water, considering how to explain his morning. "I met someone," he said finally. "At the park. A woman named Eleanor Aldrich." Rosa's hands stilled on the cutting board. "Aldrich? From College Hill? Marco, what were you doing up there?" "No, Mama. I met her at Roger Williams Park. There was a lost child and—" He proceeded to tell her about the morning's events, about Eleanor's kindness and their conversation. "Be careful, figlio mio," Rosa warned, though her voice was gentle. "Those people, their world is very different from ours." Meanwhile, across the city, Eleanor sat in her study, the afternoon light casting different shadows than usual, or perhaps she was just seeing them differently. Mrs. Sullivan had noticed the change in her employer's demeanor as soon as she'd returned home, but wisely said nothing, simply bringing tea and quietly removing the breakfast that had gone cold hours before. Eleanor found herself looking up information about prosthetic limbs on her tablet, researching the challenges faced by amputees. She thought about Marco's dignity, how he'd refused payment for helping Lucy, the way he'd tried to hide his exhaustion during their conversation. The contrast between his physical struggles and his gentle spirit stirred something in her that had been dormant for too long. Her phone buzzed with a text from her sister in Boston, another well-meaning check-in that she usually ignored. This time she found herself typing a response. "Had coffee with someone interesting today. We'll tell you about it soon." The reply was almost immediate. "Really? That's wonderful, Ellie." Eleanor set the phone down, her gaze falling on Timothy's photograph. For the first time in months, looking at his smile didn't feel like a knife in her heart. Instead, she remembered how he'd always been the first to help others, how he'd volunteer at the local shelter every weekend. Marco's kindness toward Lucy had reminded her so much of Timothy's spirit. Standing up, Eleanor walked to her bedroom and opened her closet. Past the designer clothes and shoes in the back corner was a box she hadn't touched in months. Inside were Timothy's volunteer t-shirts, carefully folded. She ran her fingers over the fabric, remembering how proud he'd been of his community service. An idea began to form in her mind, tentative at first, then growing stronger. The autumn fundraiser she'd been avoiding. Perhaps it was time to think about it differently. Not as a social obligation, but as an opportunity to make a real difference in someone's life. She walked to the window, watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant oranges and pinks over the Providence skyline. Somewhere in the city, a young man with a crutch and a rescue dog was probably heading home to his family, carrying the weight of their struggles on his shoulders. Eleanor Aldrich, who had everything money could buy but had lost what mattered most, felt something shift in her soul. A door opening, letting in a glimmer of light she thought had been extinguished forever. The city stretched out before her, a tapestry of lives intertwined in ways she'd never considered before. College Hill and Federal Hill, wealth and struggle, loss and hope. Perhaps these weren't separate worlds after all, but pieces of a larger story waiting to be told. Eleanor's fingers hovered over her phone's screen. The business card Marco had reluctantly accepted, now propped against her morning coffee cup. A week had passed since their chance encounter, and she'd spent countless hours thinking about the young man's quiet strength and his family's struggles. The autumn fundraiser committee meeting was scheduled for that afternoon, and for the first time in months, Eleanor felt a spark of purpose. Mrs. Sullivan entered the study with fresh flowers, pausing when she noticed Eleanor actually dressed for the day in a tailored navy suit. "You're attending the committee meeting?" she asked, trying to keep the surprise from her voice. "Yes," Eleanor replied, straightening her pearl necklace. "And I need you to help me prepare the garden room for guests. We'll be hosting it here after all." The housekeeper's face lit up with careful hope. As she arranged the roses in a crystal vase, she watched Eleanor dial a number on her phone. "Marco, this is Eleanor Aldrich from the park," she said, when the call connected. "I was wondering if you might help me with something." Across town, Marco stood in the small alley behind De Pasquale Square, taking his break from his morning shift at the recycling center. The unexpected call from Eleanor had caught him off guard, but her proposal intrigued him. "You want me to tell stories at your fundraiser?" he asked, watching Rocky chase pigeons nearby. "Yes," Eleanor's voice carried genuine enthusiasm. "The way you handled the situation with Lucy showed me you have a gift for connecting with children. The fundraiser benefits local youth programs, and I thought, well, we could set up a storytelling corner in the garden. The children always get bored during these events." Marco thought about the stories he used to tell the neighborhood kids before Sophia's illness had consumed so much of his time and energy. He remembered how their eyes would light up, how they'd beg for just one more tale. "I don't exactly fit in with your usual crowd," he said hesitantly. "That's exactly why I want you there," Eleanor replied. "This year needs to be different. Real." Later that afternoon, Eleanor stood before the fundraiser committee in her garden room, sunlight streaming through the conservatory windows. The ladies of Providence's elite social circle sat in perfectly coordinated autumn outfits, their expressions a mixture of relief at her return and uncertainty about her proposed changes. "Instead of the usual formal affair," Eleanor explained, her voice growing stronger with each word, "I want to create something more inclusive. Yes, we'll still have the silent auction and champagne reception, but I want to add elements that bring our community together. Story time for the children, local artisans selling their work, perhaps even a small farmers market section." Margaret Blackwell, her closest friend on the committee, leaned forward. "Ellie, dear, are you sure? The traditional format has always been so successful." "Times change, Margaret, and so must we." Eleanor's tone was firm but kind. "I've already spoken with a wonderful storyteller who has agreed to participate." As the committee members began to warm to her ideas, suggesting additional local vendors and entertainment, Eleanor felt something shift inside her. The emptiness that had consumed her for so long was being filled with something new, not replacing what she'd lost, but creating space for different kinds of joy. That evening, she drove to Federal Hill, following Marco's careful directions to his family's apartment above the square. The narrow streets were alive with the evening bustle of restaurants and shops, so different from the manicured quiet of College Hill. Rosa Carnevale opened the door, wiping her hands on her apron, her expression guarded but polite. The aroma of cooking filled the small apartment. Garlic, basil, and something that made Eleanor's mouth water despite her usual careful diet. "Please, come in," Rosa said, gesturing to their modest living room. "Marco will be home soon. He's picking up Sophia's medication." Eleanor sat carefully on the worn but clean sofa, suddenly aware of how out of place her designer outfit looked in these surroundings. Rocky padded over to greet her, and she gratefully ran her fingers through his fur, the simple contact grounding her. Sophia emerged from her room, moving slowly but with determination. Eleanor was struck by the girl's ethereal beauty, even with her pale complexion and the dark circles under her eyes. "Marco said you want him to tell stories at your party," Sophia said, settling into an armchair with Rocky at her feet. "Yes," Eleanor smiled. "He has a special gift. He used to tell me stories when I was too sick to get out of bed," Sophia shared, her voice soft with memory. "He would make up adventures about a girl who could fly above the city, watching over everyone like a guardian angel." Rosa returned with a tray of espresso and homemade biscotti, the hospitality inherent in her nature, overcoming her initial reservations. "My Marco," He has a good heart. Like his father. The three women fell into conversation, awkward at first, then warming as they found common ground in their love for Marco and their appreciation for his gentle spirit. Eleanor found herself sharing stories about Timothy, something she hadn't been able to do in months, while Rosa spoke of her late husband and the accident that had changed their lives. When Marco arrived home, he paused in the doorway, taking in the unexpected scene. His mother and Eleanor laughing over coffee, Sophia looking more animated than she had in weeks, Rocky contentedly sprawled across both women's feet. "You're just in time," Rosa called out. "Stay for dinner, Eleanor." "I made too much pasta anyway." Eleanor opened her mouth to decline, to retreat to her familiar world of careful portions and silent meals, but something in the warmth of the invitation made her pause. "I'd love to," she found herself saying, and the smile that lit up Marco's tired face told her she'd made the right choice. As they gathered around the small kitchen table, plates heaped with Rosa's homemade gnocchi, Eleanor felt the walls she'd built around her heart beginning to crack. Here in this modest apartment, filled with love and resilience, she was learning that family could take many forms, and healing could come from the most unexpected places. The weeks leading up to the autumn fundraiser transformed the Aldrich Mansion's gardens into a celebration of community spirit. Eleanor threw herself into the preparations with an energy that surprised even her, working alongside Marco to create a space that would bridge Providence's diverse neighborhoods. Marco spent his evenings after work helping to set up the storytelling corner, transforming a quiet section of the garden into a magical space with twinkling lights and comfortable cushions. Eleanor watched him work, noting how he never complained about the extra hours despite his obvious fatigue. "The children will love this," she said one evening, bringing him a thermos of coffee. "You've created something special here." Marco looked up from where he was arranging the seating area, his face glowing with pride. "I've been practicing the stories with Sophia. She helps me come up with new endings, adds little details. It's the most engaged I've seen her in months." Eleanor sat beside him on one of the cushions, inhaling the crisp autumn air. "How is she doing?" "Really?" Marco's expression tightened slightly. "The new treatment, it's helping, but the cost..." He trailed off, not wanting to burden Eleanor with his family's struggles. But Eleanor had already begun making discreet inquiries. She'd spoken with her contacts at Rhode Island Hospital, learning about experimental treatments and specialists. The information was carefully filed away. She knew Marco wouldn't accept outright charity, but perhaps there were other ways to help. The day of the fundraiser dawned clear and cool, perfect autumn weather. The gardens came alive with activity as vendors set up their stalls. Local musicians tuned their instruments, and the first guests began to arrive. Eleanor stood at the entrance, greeting both her usual social circle and the new faces from all over Providence. Marco's storytelling sessions quickly became the highlight of the event. Children from both affluent families and local neighborhoods sat together, captivated by his tales of courage, friendship, and magic. Parents lingered at the edges, equally enchanted by the young man who could weave such spellbinding narratives despite his physical challenges. "He's remarkable," Margaret Blackwell commented to Eleanor as they watched Marco begin another story, Rocky faithfully at his side. "I've never seen the children so engaged. And did you try those incredible cannoli from Federal Hill? This new format is a wonderful success." Eleanor smiled, remembering her initial fears about changing the traditional event. The garden paths were filled with a diverse mix of Providence residents, College Hill matrons chatting with Federal Hill grandmothers about recipes, young professionals buying handcrafted jewelry from local artisans, children from different neighborhoods playing together on the lawn. During a break between stories, Eleanor found Marco resting on a bench near the rose garden. "You should be very proud," she said, joining him. "You've touched so many hearts today." "It's strange," he replied, watching the crowds mingle. "Growing up, College Hill seemed like another world. But today, seeing everyone together like this, maybe the distances between us aren't as great as we think." Eleanor followed his gaze to where Sophia sat, with a group of young art students from RISD discussing their sketches of the garden. Her cheeks had more color than usual, and her laugh carried across the lawn. Rosa, taking a break from serving her famous Italian cookies, beamed with pride at her children. "I've been thinking," Eleanor said carefully. "The hospital's youth program needs a regular storyteller for their pediatric ward. It's a paid position with flexible hours. Would you be interested? Marco turned to her, surprise and emotion playing across his face. You didn't have to. I didn't, she interrupted gently. I merely mentioned to the right people what a gifted storyteller I knew. The rest was all you, Marco. They saw your talent today just as I did in the park. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the garden, Eleanor watched the last guests depart. The event had raised more money than ever before, but the real success couldn't be measured in dollars. She saw it in the connections made, the barriers broken down, the smiles shared between people who might never have met otherwise. Mrs. Sullivan appeared at her side with a cup of tea. It's been a wonderful day, Miss Aldrich. I haven't seen you so alive in such a long time. Eleanor took the tea, realizing her housekeeper was right. The heaviness that had weighed on her heart for so long hadn't disappeared, but it had shifted, making room for new possibilities, new connections, new purpose. Later that night, as she prepared for bed, Eleanor passed Timothy's room. The door, which had remained firmly closed for months, was slightly ajar. She stepped inside, running her fingers over his photography equipment, his lacrosse stick, the framed acceptance letters. You would have loved today, sweetheart, she whispered. You always said we needed to do more for our community. I think I'm finally understanding what you meant. Down on Federal Hill, Marco sat on their small balcony with Sophia, sharing the last of Rosa's cookies and recounting the day's events. Rocky dozed at their feet, worn out from all the attention he'd received. Tell me again about the girl who learned to fly, Sophia requested, wrapping herself in a blanket against the evening chill. As Marco began the familiar tale, adding new details inspired by the day's events, he thought about how his world had expanded in unexpected ways since that morning in the park. Eleanor's friendship had opened doors he never thought possible, not just for him, but for his entire family. The story of the flying girl now had a new character, a wise woman who helped her discover her wings had been there all along, waiting for the right moment to unfold. As he spoke, the lights of Providence twinkled below them, and somewhere on College Hill, in a mansion that no longer felt quite so empty, Eleanor Aldrich was finally beginning to heal. The pediatric ward at Rhode Island Hospital buzzed with a different kind of energy on story days. Marco had been working there for a month now, and word had spread quickly among the young patients about the magical tales he would weave. Today, he sat in the brightly decorated common room, Rocky by his side, surrounded by children in wheelchairs and hospital gowns. Tell us about the flying girl again, a small voice called out from the back. Marco smiled, catching sight of a new face, a young girl with familiar eyes that reminded him of his sister. Today, he began, his voice taking on the warm, engaging tone that had become his trademark, our flying girl discovered something amazing about her powers. You see, she learned that she could share them with others. As Marco spun his tale, Eleanor stood in the doorway unnoticed. She'd come to discuss some hospital board matters, but found herself drawn to the sound of his storytelling. The scene before her touched something deep in her heart. The way the children leaned forward, momentarily forgetting their illnesses, the gentle way Marco included each child in the story, making them feel special. Later, as they walked through the hospital corridors together, Eleanor noticed Marco's slight limp was more pronounced than usual. You're pushing yourself too hard, she observed, concerned. There's a new treatment Sophia's doctor mentioned, he admitted. The storytelling job helps, but he trailed off, his pride still struggling with their growing friendship. Eleanor had already heard about the treatment through her hospital board connections. The hospital has a program for innovative therapies, she said carefully. As a board member, I could help expedite the application process. Marco stopped walking, turning to face her. Eleanor, I can't ask you to... You're not asking, she interrupted gently. I'm offering. To not charity, Marco. An opportunity just like the storytelling position. Sophia deserves a chance. That evening, Eleanor drove to Federal Hill for her now regular Thursday dinner with the Carnivals. These weekly gatherings had become a highlight in her life, filling her elegant mansion with warm memories to carry her through the quieter days. She found Sophia sitting at their small kitchen table, sketching in a notebook, while Rosa prepared dinner. The young girl's artistic talent had blossomed since starting the new treatment, her drawings capturing the vibrancy of their neighborhood in bold, confident strokes. Look what I drew today, Sophia said excitedly, showing Eleanor her latest work. a detailed sketch of the view from College Hill, including Eleanor's mansion in the distance. "It's beautiful," Eleanor breathed, noting the careful attention to detail. "You have a remarkable gift, Sophia." Rosa wiped her hands on her apron, peering over their shoulders at the drawing. She's always had an artist's soul, like her father. But lately, she smiled at Eleanor, a look of deep gratitude in her eyes. The kitchen filled with the aroma of Rosa's cooking and the sound of comfortable conversation. Eleanor had learned to make proper Italian coffee under Rosa's tutelage, though she still couldn't quite match the older woman's technique. These simple moments of connection had begun to heal something in her that expensive therapy sessions had never touched. "I've been thinking," Eleanor said as they sat down to dinner. "The mansion has a carriage house that's just sitting empty. It has its own entrance, a small garden." She took a deep breath. "It would be perfect for a family of 3 and their dog." The kitchen fell silent. Marco looked at his mother, then back at Eleanor. "We couldn't possibly—" "The rent would be reasonable," Eleanor continued, "and it would be closer to the hospital for Sophia's treatments, closer to your storytelling job, Marco. The garden could be yours to tend, Rosa. I've seen how you make magic with just a few pots on your balcony." Rosa's hands trembled slightly as she served the pasta. "It's too much, Eleanor. We couldn't—" "Please," Eleanor's voice caught with emotion. "That house has been empty for so long. It needs life, laughter, the smell of Rosa's cooking, Sophia's art on the walls. You wouldn't be taking anything from me. You'd be giving me something I've been missing." Marco watched the interplay of emotions across his mother's face, remembering her dreams of a garden, of a space where Sophia could recover in peace. He thought about the long bus rides to the hospital, the stairs that seemed to grow steeper every day as his sister's strength waxed and waned. "We would pay proper rent," he said firmly. "No charity." Eleanor nodded, understanding his need for dignity. "Of course. And perhaps Rosa could help Mrs. Sullivan with the main house gardens sometimes, if she wanted to." Rosa's eyes lit up at the mention of the gardens she'd admired during the fundraiser. "The roses there, they need a more experienced hand," she said thoughtfully. "Mrs. Sullivan tries, but Italian gardeners, we know these things." Sophia's sketch lay on the table between them, the 2 hills of Providence connected on paper as they were increasingly becoming in life. Rocky, sensing the importance of the moment, moved from his spot by Marco's chair to sit between them all, his tail wagging hopefully. "When can we see it?" Sophia asked, her voice full of quiet excitement. Eleanor smiled, feeling the familiar weight of grief lift just a little more. "How about this weekend? The autumn colors in the garden are at their peak, perfect for an artist's eye." As they continued their dinner, making plans and sharing hopes, Eleanor realized that the carriage house wasn't the only empty space being filled. The mansion that had become a mausoleum to her grief was slowly transforming back into a home, not just for her, but for this family that had unexpectedly become part of her life. Marco watched Eleanor with his sister, the way they bent their heads together over Sophia's sketchbook, planning where her art studio could be in the carriage house. He saw his mother's eyes sparkle as she discussed garden designs with their potential new landlady, and felt Rocky's solid warmth against his leg, a reminder of how one small act of kindness had set all of this in motion. The evening light filtered through the kitchen window, casting a golden glow over their small gathering. Outside, the bells of Holy Ghost Church rang the Angelus, their sound carrying across Federal Hill, a reminder of endings and beginnings, of prayers answered in unexpected ways. The carriage house stood at the edge of the Aldrich property, its red brick facade softened by climbing ivy and the golden light of early morning. Eleanor watched from her study window as Marco and Rosa explored the small garden, their expressions a mixture of wonder and cautious hope. Sophia sat on the stone bench beneath the old maple tree, her sketchbook already open, capturing the moment in swift, sure strokes. Mrs. Sullivan bustled about, showing Rosa the herb garden she'd attempted to maintain. "I can never get the basil to grow properly," she admitted, and Eleanor smiled as Rosa immediately launched into an enthusiastic explanation about proper soil and sunlight. The carriage house had been converted into a comfortable living space years ago, though it had stood empty since Eleanor's parents moved to Florida. The ground floor featured a cozy living room with large windows, a modern kitchen that would make Rosa's eyes light up, and a small dining area. Upstairs, 3 bedrooms and a studio space that seemed designed for Sophia's artistic pursuits awaited new life. Marco stood in the garden, watching his sister and mother explore their potential new home. The morning sun caught the silver threads in Rosa's dark hair as she examined the rose bushes, already making plans in rapid-fire Italian. Sophia moved from room to room with growing excitement, each space sparking new ideas for her art. "The rent you quoted," Marco said quietly to Eleanor. "It's well below market value." "The market in this neighborhood is different," Eleanor replied carefully. "And having good tenants, people who will care for the property, that's worth more than a few extra dollars." Marco's expression remained troubled. "I don't want my family to be a charity case, Eleanor. We've always managed on our own." Eleanor turned to face him fully, her voice firm but kind. "Marco, look at your mother right now. Really look at her. When was the last time you saw her this animated, this hopeful? And Sophia, she's already planning where to put her easel in that upstairs studio. This isn't charity. This is family helping family." The word family hung between them, weighted with meaning. Over the past weeks, the boundaries between their worlds had blurred, transforming their chance encounter into something deeper and more meaningful than either could have predicted. Inside the carriage house, Sophia had discovered the window seat in what would be her bedroom. Sunlight streamed through the leaded glass, creating patterns on the wooden floor. "Marco," she called out, "come see. It's perfect for reading, and look at the view of the garden." Rocky, who had been following Rosa's garden tour with great interest, bounded up the stairs at the sound of Sophia's voice. The dog had already claimed a sunny spot in the living room as his own, seeming to understand that this place could be their new home. As Marco joined his sister at the window seat, Eleanor stayed back, watching the scene unfold. She remembered Timothy sitting in that same spot, surrounded by books, looking up with a smile when she brought him hot chocolate on cold afternoons. For the first time, the memory brought more warmth than pain. "The kitchen needs updating," Mrs. Sullivan commented, joining Eleanor. "And the garden hasn't been properly tended in years. I have a feeling Rosa will take care of that," Eleanor smiled, watching the older woman already making plans with her hands, gesturing to where she would plant her beloved herbs and vegetables. The morning stretched into afternoon as they explored every corner of the carriage house. Rosa discovered the original fixtures in the kitchen, exclaiming over the possibilities. Sophia found the perfect angle of light in the studio space, immediately sitting down to sketch her vision for the room. Marco calculated bus routes to the hospital and his storytelling jobs, finding them all more manageable from this location. "We should discuss the terms," Marco said finally, his practical nature asserting itself despite his family's obvious enthusiasm. Eleanor nodded, leading him to the small study off the living room. As they worked out the details, she noticed how Marco's natural dignity never wavered, even as she insisted on including utilities in the reasonable rent. They agreed on a month-to-month lease to start, though they both knew this arrangement was meant to be more permanent. "There's one more thing," Eleanor said, pulling out a folder. "The hospital board reviewed Sophia's case. She's been approved for the new treatment program, with most costs covered by the hospital's Innovative Therapy Fund." Marco's hands trembled slightly as he took the folder. "How?" "The board was very impressed by her art portfolio," Eleanor said simply, "and by her brother's work in the pediatric ward. These opportunities exist, Marco. Accepting them doesn't diminish your strength. It proves it." As the afternoon light began to fade, they gathered in the carriage house kitchen. Mrs. Sullivan had brought sandwiches and coffee, and Rosa had somehow produced a batch of her famous cookies, despite the excitement of the day. Sophia sat at the counter, still sketching, while Rocky dozed at her feet. "When can we move in?" Sophia asked, looking up from her drawing. Marco glanced at Eleanor, then at his mother. Rosa's eyes were bright with unshed tears as she nodded slightly. "The lease can start next month," Eleanor said, her heart full as she watched their faces light up. "That gives us time to update the kitchen and prepare the garden for spring planting." As they celebrated with cookies and coffee, Eleanor felt the familiar presence of Timothy in the room, not as a shadow of grief but as a warm memory. He would have loved this, she thought. He would have helped Sophia set up her art studio, would have joined Marco in his storytelling sessions, would have appreciated Rosa's cooking and gardening wisdom. The carriage house, which had stood empty for so long, was already coming alive with plans and dreams. Rosa and Mrs. Sullivan discussed kitchen renovations, their initial formality dissolving into genuine friendship. Sophia showed Eleanor her sketches for each room, her artistic vision transforming the space on paper before they'd even moved in. Marco found Eleanor by the window as the others continued their planning. "Thank you," he said simply, his voice thick with emotion. "Not just for the house, but for seeing us, really seeing us." Eleanor placed her hand on his arm, understanding all that remained unspoken. Through their friendship, through this unexpected joining of their lives, they had both found something they thought lost forever, a sense of belonging, of family, of home. The first snow of winter dusted College Hill in white, transforming the Aldrich estate into a scene from a holiday card. Smoke curled from the carriage house chimney, where the Carnivals had been living for just over a month. The transition from Federal Hill had been smoother than anyone expected, as if the old building had been waiting for precisely this family to bring it back to life. Rosa's influence was already evident in the garden, even in winter. She had spent the weeks before the first frost preparing the beds for spring, working alongside Mrs. Sullivan with an enthusiasm that bridged any language barriers between them. The herb garden, though dormant, was meticulously organized with markers in both English and Italian, promising fragrant harvests to come. Inside the carriage house, Sophia sat at her new drawing table, positioned perfectly to catch the northern light. Her health had improved significantly since starting the new treatment, and her art reflected this renewed vitality. The walls of her studio space were covered with sketches and paintings, scenes from both Federal Hill and College Hill, landscapes that bridged the two worlds she now inhabited. "Sophia," Marco called from downstairs, "time for your medication." She smiled at her brother's punctuality. Even with their improved circumstances, Marco remained vigilantly protective. The new treatment was working wonders, but it required strict adherence to a complex schedule of medications and rest periods. Marco had arranged his storytelling sessions at the hospital around Sophia's treatment times, ensuring he was always there when she needed him. Eleanor stood in her study, watching the scene through her window. The carriage house glowed with warmth and life, such a contrast to how it had stood empty for so many years. She found herself spending more and more time in this room, drawn to the view of the family going about their daily routines. The sound of Rocky barking drew her attention. The dog was playing in the snow with Marco, who had finally agreed to try a more advanced prosthetic leg that Eleanor had helped him discover through her hospital connections. His movement was becoming more natural, though he still kept his crutch for security. The joy in his face as he threw snowballs for Rocky to chase reminded Eleanor of Timothy's love for winter games. A knock at her study door interrupted her thoughts. "Come in," she called, expecting Mrs. Sullivan with her afternoon tea. Instead, Rosa entered carrying a tray of something that smelled divine. "You missed lunch," she said firmly. "I made zuppa toscana, good for cold days." Eleanor smiled, touched by the care in Rosa's voice. The older woman had taken it upon herself to ensure Eleanor didn't skip meals, often appearing with homemade Italian dishes that made the finest restaurant fare seem bland in comparison. "Join me," Eleanor gestured to the comfortable chairs by the fireplace. As they sat together sharing the soup and warm bread, Rosa spoke of her plans for the spring garden. Her English had improved dramatically over the past month, though she still peppered her speech with Italian phrases that Eleanor was beginning to understand. "Marco," Rosa said suddenly, her tone becoming serious. "He smiles more now, like before the accident that took his father and his leg. And Sophia." She paused, emotion catching in her throat. "The doctors say her numbers are better each week." Eleanor reached out and squeezed Rosa's hand. "You've all brought so much life back to this place," she said softly. "I should be thanking you." Through the window, they could see Sophia had joined Marco and Rocky in the snow. She was wearing the warm winter coat Eleanor had insisted on giving her as a housewarming gift, her cheeks pink with cold and happiness as she sketched the snow-covered gardens. "She wants to apply to RIESD," Rosa confided. "The art teachers at her online school say she has real talent." Eleanor nodded, having seen Sophia's portfolio growing more impressive by the day. "The hospital board's scholarship program," she mused thoughtfully. "They're always looking for stories of success from their treatment programs. Sophia's art, combined with her progress, it could make a compelling application." The afternoon light began to fade, and the first floor lights of the carriage house clicked on, creating warm squares of gold in the gathering dusk. Mrs. Sullivan appeared with tea for both women, having learned to make it strong enough for Eleanor's taste but sweet enough for Rosa's. "The Christmas Charity Event Planning Committee called," Mrs. Sullivan mentioned. "They're hoping you'll host again this year after the success of the autumn fundraiser." Eleanor considered this, watching Marco help Sophia back inside as the temperature dropped. The autumn event had changed something in Providence's social landscape, breaking down barriers that had seemed impenetrable. The Christmas event could build on that foundation. "Tell them yes," she decided, "but with some conditions. I want it to be like the autumn event, inclusive, real. And I know a wonderful storyteller who can share Christmas tales from both Italy and New England." Rosa's eyes lit up. "I could make traditional Italian Christmas cookies," she offered. "And Sophia's art? Maybe a small exhibition?" As they discussed possibilities, Eleanor felt the familiar ache in her heart shift and change. The holidays had loomed as a dreaded obstacle, a time when Timothy's absence would feel most acute. But now, watching the lights in the carriage house and listening to Rosa's enthusiastic planning, she felt something new growing alongside the grief, not replacing it, but transforming it into something that could coexist with joy. Later that evening, Eleanor walked through the snow to the carriage house for their now traditional family dinner. The smell of Rosa's cooking guided her through the dark, and Rocky's welcoming bark announced her arrival. Through the window, she could see Marco setting the table, while Sophia arranged flowers she had painted earlier that day. A family scene that now, somehow, included her. The snow continued to fall softly, erasing the boundaries between the main house and the carriage house, between past and present, between what was lost and what was found. In the warmth of the kitchen, surrounded by the family that fate had brought into her life, Eleanor finally understood that healing didn't mean forgetting. It meant making room for new love alongside the old, allowing joy to grow in the spaces grief had carved. The Christmas charity event transformed the Aldrich mansion into a wonderland of lights and warmth. Eleanor had opened not just the traditional formal rooms, but the entire first floor, creating a flow between spaces that encouraged mingling between Providence's different communities. The scent of Rosa's Italian Christmas cookies wafted from the kitchen, mixing with the traditional pine and cinnamon of New England holiday celebrations. In the library, Marco had set up his storytelling corner, more elaborate than the garden version from the autumn. Children sat on plush cushions, their faces glowing in the light of tastefully arranged Christmas lights, as he wove tales that blended Italian folklore with American holiday traditions. Rocky, wearing a festive collar, moved among the children, offering comfort to the shy ones and delighting the bold. Sophia's art exhibition in the conservatory had drawn considerable attention. Her evolution as an artist was evident in the displayed works, from early sketches of Federal Hill to her recent pieces capturing the synthesis of her two worlds. A particularly striking painting showed the view from College Hill at sunset, the lights of Federal Hill glowing warmly in the distance, bridges and rivers connecting the two communities. "Your daughter has remarkable talent," a board member from RISD commented to Rosa, who beamed with pride as she offered another tray of cookies. "She has a remarkable spirit," Rosa replied, her English confident now. "The art, it comes from her heart." Eleanor moved through the crowds, the perfect hostess once again, but different from before. Her smile reached her eyes now, and her conversations were genuine rather than merely polite. She paused often to watch Marco's storytelling sessions, each time catching new details in his tales that reflected their shared experiences of loss and renewal. In the kitchen, Mrs. Sullivan and Rosa had created an efficient partnership, directing an army of volunteers in serving both traditional New England holiday fare and Italian Christmas specialties. The two women had developed their own language of nods and gestures, their initial awkwardness replaced by genuine friendship. "Eleanor," Margaret Blackwell approached, her eyes wide with appreciation. "You've outdone yourself this year. It's not just an event, it's a true community gathering." Eleanor smiled, watching a group of children from Marco's hospital storytelling sessions mingle with children from Providence's most privileged families, all equally enchanted by Rocky's tricks. "That's exactly what it's meant to be," she replied. What it should have been all along. As the evening progressed, Eleanor found herself in the quiet of her study, taking a moment to absorb it all. The photograph of Timothy on her desk seemed different now, still precious, still loved, but no longer the center around which her grief revolved. Next to it stood a new frame, holding one of Sophia's sketches, a scene of their extended family sharing dinner in the carriage house, every face captured with loving detail. A soft knock preceded Marco's entrance. "Taking a break from the stories?" she asked, noting his slight limp. He'd been on his feet for hours. "Sophia's doing a drawing demonstration for the children," he explained, settling into one of the chairs. "She's amazing with them, patient, encouraging, like you've been with all of us." Eleanor shook her head. "You have it backward, Marco. Your family, you've given me so much more than I could ever give you. You've helped me remember how to live." Through the study window they could see the carriage house, its windows glowing warmly in the winter night. Christmas lights outlined its eaves, Sophia's artistic touch evident in the arrangement. The small garden, though dormant under snow, showed signs of Rosa's planning for spring, with new trellises waiting for climbing roses and herbs. "I used to think success meant making it on my own," Marco said quietly. "Proving I could provide for my family despite everything. But now I understand. Real strength is knowing when to let others in, when to accept help and friendship." Eleanor thought about the changes in her own life since that chance encounter in the park. The mansion no longer echoed with emptiness. Instead, it rang with Sophia's laughter during her art lessons with visiting RISD professors, filled with the aroma of Rosa's cooking during their shared meals, warmed by Marco's storytelling sessions that had expanded to include weekly community gatherings. "Listen," she said suddenly. From downstairs came the sound of children laughing, music playing, conversations in English and Italian mixing in the air. The mansion was alive again, but in a different way than before. Timothy's presence was still there, but now it felt like a blessing rather than a ghost, as if he would have approved of all these changes. "We should get back," Marco stood, offering his arm with a smile. "Mama will scold us both if we miss her Struffoli presentation." As they walked back to the party, Eleanor squeezed Marco's arm gently. "Thank you," she said simply. He understood she wasn't just thanking him for the escort or the evening stories. She was thanking him for that day in the park, for his kindness to a lost child that led to saving a lost soul, for showing her that family could be found in the most unexpected places. The Christmas lights twinkled around them, and somewhere in the gathering, Rocky barked joyfully at some new discovery. The sound of Sophia's voice carried from the conservatory, explaining her artistic process to an attentive audience, while Rosa's laughter blended with Mrs. Sullivan's from the kitchen. Together, they rejoined their unlikely but perfect family, stepping from the quiet of the study into the warmth of a love that had grown strong enough to heal them all. The first signs of spring emerged in the Aldrich estate gardens, where Rosa's careful planning during the winter months was beginning to show results. Early crocuses pushed through the melting snow, and tiny green buds appeared on the rose bushes she had tenderly pruned. The garden was becoming a physical manifestation of their journey, a blend of traditional New England plantings and Mediterranean herbs, each enhancing the other's beauty. Inside the main house, Eleanor sat in her study, reviewing a thick envelope from RISD. Sophia's application portfolio had been submitted months ago, and now the moment of truth had arrived. She resisted the urge to open it, knowing this moment belonged to Sophia and her family. The past few months had brought more changes than anyone could have predicted. Marco's storytelling program at the hospital had expanded to include art therapy sessions led by Sophia, where young patients could draw and paint while listening to his tales. The combination of visual and narrative art had proven remarkably effective, drawing attention from medical journals and healing arts programs across the country. Eleanor's phone buzzed with a text from Marco. "Sophia's last test results came in. Doctor says the treatment was successful. She's in remission." The words blurred as tears filled Eleanor's eyes. She remembered the day she'd first met them, how fragile Sophia had seemed, how weighted down Marco had been with worry. Now sitting in her study with the raised envelope in her hands and this message on her phone, she felt the full impact of how far they'd all come. Rosa's voice carried from the garden, where she was teaching Mrs. Sullivan the proper way to plant basil. "No, no, cara mia, you must sing to it. The herbs, they need love in their soil." Their laughter floated up through the open window, a sound that had become wonderfully common in recent months. Eleanor gathered her things and made her way to the carriage house. The path between the two buildings was well worn now, traced by countless footsteps carrying food, friendship and family between the spaces. Rocky met her halfway, his tail wagging in greeting, ever the faithful guardian of both homes. Inside the carriage house, she found Sophia in her studio, surrounded by her artwork. The space had evolved into a true artist's sanctuary, filled with light and color. The girl who had once been too weak to leave her bed now stood confidently at her easel, her health restored not just by medicine, but by love, purpose, and community. "Eleanor," Sophia's face lit up. "I was just finishing a piece for the hospital children's ward. Want to see?" The painting showed a scene from one of Marco's stories, The Flying Girl, but now she wasn't alone. She was surrounded by other children, each with their own special power, their own way of rising above their challenges. Eleanor recognized the faces of several young patients, transformed in Sophia's imagination into heroes of their own stories. "I have something for you," Eleanor said, holding out the RISD envelope. Sophia's hands trembled as she took it. "I can't. Will you open it?" "Together," Eleanor suggested, helping her break the seal. As they read the acceptance letter, with its offer of a full scholarship, tears flowed freely. Sophia threw her arms around Eleanor, who held her close, remembering similar moments with Timothy, his college acceptance letters still pinned to his bulletin board upstairs. "I have to tell Marco and Mama," Sophia exclaimed, but then paused, looking at Eleanor with sudden understanding. Would you come with me to tell them? You're part of this too." "Part of us." The words touched Eleanor deeply. She had slowly come to realize that healing hadn't meant leaving Timothy behind. It meant expanding her heart to love more, to embrace this family that fate had brought into her life. They found Marco and Rosa in the garden, where spring's work was in full swing. Marco was using his new prosthetic with growing confidence, helping his mother prepare beds for summer vegetables. The sight of them working together, Rosa directing with gentle authority, and Marco teasing her about her perfectionism, made Eleanor's heart full. "We have news," Sophia announced, holding up the acceptance letter. What followed was a burst of joy, Rosa crying and praising the saints, Marco hugging his sister with fierce pride, Mrs. Sullivan appearing with a bottle of Prosecco she'd been saving for a special occasion. As they celebrated in the garden, surrounded by the new life Rosa had coaxed from the soil, Eleanor watched her found family with deep contentment. "A toast," Marco proposed, once everyone had a glass. "To new beginnings, to healing, and to the strange ways love finds us when we need it most." The spring breeze carried the scent of thawing earth and growing things, of possibilities and promises. Eleanor raised her glass, remembering another spring day long ago when she'd first brought Timothy home to this house. Now, as she stood in the garden with her new family, she felt his presence not as an absence, but as a blessing, a reminder that love never truly ends. It just finds new ways to grow. Rocky barked at a passing butterfly, making them all laugh. Sophia was already sketching the scene in her ever-present notebook, capturing this moment of joy for posterity. Rosa wiped happy tears from her eyes, muttering Italian prayers of gratitude, while Mrs. Sullivan discreetly dabbed at her own eyes with her apron. The garden, like their lives, was a work in progress, some parts fully bloomed, others just beginning to show promise, all of it growing together into something beautiful and unexpected. As the spring sun warmed their faces, Eleanor looked at the family surrounding her and knew that this was what Timothy had meant when he talked about making a difference in the world, not through grand gestures, but through small acts of love that rippled outward, touching life after life, creating connections that healed and transformed. 1 year after their chance encounter in Roger Williams Park, Eleanor stood in her garden, surrounded by the results of Rosa's loving care. The rose bushes were heavy with blooms, their fragrance mixing with the herbs that now grew in abundantly organized beds. The garden had become a symbol of their shared journey, the careful nurturing, the patience through difficult seasons, the joy of watching new life flourish. The occasion was Sophia's graduation from high school and celebration of her acceptance to RISD. Tables dotted the lawn between the main house and the carriage house, covered with a mixture of elegant catering and Rosa's homemade Italian specialties. Guests moved easily between both worlds, hospital board members chatting with Federal Hill neighbors. Marco's young patients playing with children from Providence's most prestigious families. Marco stood near his storytelling corner, now a permanent fixture in the garden, speaking with the hospital's chief of pediatrics about expanding the program to other hospitals in the region. His new prosthetic leg allowed him to move with confidence, though Rocky still stayed close, ever watchful. The dog had grown plump with love and care, a far cry from the scared creature they'd rescued from the recycling center. "Did you ever imagine this?" Rosa asked, joining Eleanor by the rose garden. "That day when Marco helped that lost little girl, did you know he was also finding us a new family?" Eleanor smiled, watching Sophia show her portfolio to an admiring group of RISD professors. Her health had been fully restored, her artistic talent flourishing along with her strength. "I think Timothy knew," she said softly. "Somehow he guided me to that park that day." Rosa squeezed her hand, understanding the mix of joy and gentle sorrow in her friend's voice. They had learned that healing didn't mean forgetting. It meant weaving the threads of loss into a new tapestry of love and connection. Mrs. Sullivan appeared with a fresh tray of Rosa's famous cookies, now in high demand at every Providence social event. The two women had developed a deep friendship, their initial awkwardness replaced by genuine affection and mutual respect. The mansion's kitchen had become a place where two culinary traditions blended seamlessly, much like the families themselves. "Eleanor!" Sophia called, running up with excitement in her eyes. "The hospital board wants to commission a series of my paintings for the new pediatric wing. They want art that tells stories like Marco's sessions but in pictures." The news sparked another round of celebration. Marco hugged his sister, his face glowing with pride. "The flying girl stories," he said, "they were always about you, you know, about all of us learning to rise above our challenges." As the afternoon wound down, Eleanor found herself sitting on the bench beneath the old maple tree, the same spot where Sophia had first sketched the carriage house. The setting sun painted the sky in colors that reminded her of her daughter-in-law's artwork, now hanging prominently in both houses. Marco joined her, Rocky settling at their feet. "A penny for your thoughts," he said, using the phrase she'd taught him months ago. "I was thinking about how life surprises us," she replied, "how the deepest pain can lead us to the most unexpected joy." She paused, watching Rosa teach Mrs. Sullivan the proper way to gesticulate while telling a story. "Timothy would have loved all of this." "He does love it," Marco said simply. "Through you, through the way you've opened your heart and home to us, through every child we help at the hospital. Love doesn't end, it just changes form." The wisdom in his words touched Eleanor deeply. She looked around at her expanded family, Rosa and Mrs. Sullivan sharing kitchen secrets, Sophia capturing the moment in her sketchbook, the garden blooming with new life, and Marco, whose simple act of kindness had set it all in motion. The evening light softened, and someone turned on the string lights that Sophia had artistically arranged throughout the garden. Their warm glow created a magical atmosphere, reflecting off the windows of both houses that were now truly one home. "Time for a story?" a young voice called out. Several children who had attended Marco's hospital sessions were still there, looking hopefully toward his storytelling corner. "There's always time for one more story," Marco smiled, standing up. "Especially today." As he began to speak, his voice carrying across the garden, Eleanor closed her eyes and let the words wash over her. This was what healing looked like. Not the absence of pain, but the presence of love, strong enough to transform it into something beautiful. Sophia joined her on the bench, sketchbook in hand. "I'm drawing us all," she explained, showing Eleanor the work in progress. "Not just how we look, but how we feel. Connected, whole, family." The last word echoed in Eleanor's heart. Family, not defined by blood or circumstance, but by love and choice, by shared meals and stories, by hands joining across social divides, by hearts opening to new possibilities. As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Eleanor looked at her expanded family and felt complete. The garden would continue to grow, Sophia's art would touch countless lives, Marco's stories would heal young hearts, and Rosa's love would nourish them all. And somewhere Timothy was smiling, knowing that his mother had found not just healing, but a new kind of happiness she never expected. The night air carried the mingled scents of roses and herbs, of past and present, of endings and beginnings. In the gentle darkness, surrounded by the family fate had brought her, Eleanor finally understood. Love was not a finite resource to be guarded, but an endless garden to be tended, where new beauty could always take root and grow.